Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Katrina Gulliver. Katrina, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, Aryeh. I'm Katrina Gulliver, a historian, writer, and random Twitter person who you may have seen if you're on Twitter a lot, like I am.
And like I am as well.
Yeah.
Actually, so that's funny because there was one Twitter-related question that I had for you, but we'll hold it to the end, and that'll be
Okay.
like a teaser. We're going to be talking about a couple things that you've written about or spoken about in the near past, and these are things that are about the past. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is a piece that you wrote that ran in the Washington Post. The headline was, "Americans put up statues during the Gilded Age. Today we're tearing them down." And we'll include the link to that below. And so this was an interesting piece about, kind of like, why are there all these statues all over America? How did they get there? When were they put there? And I learned some interesting stuff from it. So can you tell us more about the piece?
Well, I was talking about how technology had changed to really make putting up statues a lot more affordable. Just at this period when there was this sense of democratization of public space, and people wanted to put money into often beautifying urban areas and making statues historically. I mean, casting in bronze has been going back for thousands of years, very labor intensive, very, very, very expensive, and the kind of thing that was really limited to royals, the church, things like that. And, technology changed with the Industrial Revolution. Techniques changed to make it a lot more affordable. And so you could have a statue for a lot less money. And also you had the popularity of the public subscription to pay for a lot of these things. People tend to forget a lot of these things. It wasn't one person decided to put up a statue. It was a group said, let's put up a statue. And then they held a public subscription for it. I mean, even the Statue of Liberty was done this way. Money was raised for her in France. French people, there was even a lottery, there were public art exhibits, there were theater productions, all to raise money to build a statue. Meanwhile, in the US, there was a public subscription to pay for the plinth that she was going to stand on, because the US government said, well, okay, you can put it there, but we're not paying for it. And so, a lot of people chipped in for these things. And I think people forget that these were often very large collective efforts, people putting in very small amounts of money. And I think that's really interesting when we look back on who got statues and where they came from, because, it does reflect often the will of a larger group of people than just sort of one individual thinking, oh, I want to put up a statue. It was this, community movement often towards these celebrating particular people or events.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes you see the names of those people like on like a plaque at the bottom of a statue, like the people who donated some amount of money to it. And okay, so you mentioned the technological aspect. So I didn't know anything about this. So it's called electro something, that this new technique that was invented like in the 1850s.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a way to essentially produce a replica of a cast of something much more easily. I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to explain this very, very well. But I think of it as like 3D modeling, kind of like the 19th century version of the fact that you can now print out a 3D model of a gun or something. But it was obviously pre-digital technology, and they could create a replica of a cast much more easily than what had been done before, and that saved a lot of money and sped up the production. And the other thing to think about is how globalized this was. A lot of these statues coming to the US, being put up in the US, were in fact made in Europe. They were sculpted by artists in Europe. They were often cast in bronze foundries in Europe and, brought by steamship to the US. I mean, it was very much a global market for these sort of sculptures. And that's one of the things I mentioned, that you had these casting factories exporting statues to all corners of the world.
Mm-hmm. And, the one was in White Plains, New York, that became one of the major American ones.
Yeah.
And so an interesting fact from the piece that I didn't know before was that I think you say that between like roughly half of the statues like currently, in public places in America were made between 1880 and 1930. And so I guess that was like the golden age of American statuary or something. And so there's the technological reasons for it became easier and thus cheaper to make a statue. And then but there are also like these cultural changes and cultural forces that made people want to put up a statue in the first place. So could you talk a little bit about those?
Well, there were a couple of factors. One was the City Beautiful movement, which was a sort of 1880s onwards movement towards, as the name suggests, people wanting urban spaces to be more appealing. You saw a lot of moves towards zoning and other structures, legislative effects of that, but also local community groups focusing on things like planting gardens, laying out parks, having urban and town spaces be more attractive in what was a particularly planned way. And it tended to be on these neoclassical principles. They wanted wide boulevards. They wanted, attractive vistas. And that created a lot of spaces where it was suitable to put a plinth. And, statues were seen as obviously picturesque, appropriate kind of street decorations. And the other thing is this is a time when, as Eric Hobsbawm, the historian, used to call it, the invention of tradition in the late 19th century, this invention of the past, even things like celebrating Thanksgiving. This is not something that people were doing continuously from the 17th century onwards. I mean, it was kind of given a real boost in the late 19th century as a national concept. And we see that with other forms of tradition that were kind of created around this period. And so this is when you had many more historic sites being designated. You had historical figures, therefore, being focused on and becoming, the town wanted to celebrate, local hero who did something in the past. And so they would put up a statue. And you see a lot of historical associations being dating to about this period where towns suddenly wanted to preserve the past of the town and also kind of create the past of the town to project an image of, a proud history of the people who lived there. And so that's where a lot of these statues came from. Who do we want to celebrate, who we think represents our community, however that community might be defined.
Mm-hmm. So in America, was the Civil War both an impetus for we need a memorial to the men who fought or who died, but also so many people did die, and there was such carnage that made people want to focus more on the past and what were they fighting for, that kind of thing?
Well, I think any war brings impetus for a lot of memorials, but I think there's a kind of a distinction you might want to make between the memorial to the fallen soldiers that oftentimes went up relatively soon after the war, and the ones that people think of as the more aggressively white supremacist celebrations of the lost cause that often went up many decades later. We're talking 1910s, 1920s, around the period that there was this resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan.
Right.
And, these things were less about memorializing particular people who died in the war and more about pushing a particular image of a, white nationalist vision. And some of them even explicitly said things on the base about, white men should lead, the South will rise again, this kind of stuff, that I think is probably detached from memorials that went up immediately after the war that was, to the dead of whatever regiment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I remember there was this initial period, I guess right after the Charlottesville violence in 2017 of pulling down statues, and then there was a video of a group of people pulling down a Confederate statue that was just an anonymous soldier, and when it hit the ground, it crumpled like it had been made. It was like an aluminum can or something. It just fell apart very quickly, and then people who knew were well, these were kind of mass produced in a very cheap way, and were distributed by Daughters of the Confederate whatever veterans, and put up. And then given, some sort of local meaning, but they were, I don't know, kind of action figures or something, just produced in a mass way. So that's interesting. I mean, because I think what you get from pieces when you see a statue, especially one that's green with rust or oxidation or whatever that is, it seems this has been here for hundreds of years, and this is kind of eternal, and it was made to last forever, but okay, well, it was made by people, and then maybe some of them were made in a more careful way, and some of them were kind of made as, we're just churning these things out, or to get it done as quickly and cheaply as possible. So that was a thought kind of occasioned by your piece. But okay, but I wanted to. Okay, sorry, were you gonna say something?
No, I was just interested in what you said, because the other element of the mass production of these sort of things was not statues, it was tombstones and funeral statuary, because the Victorian period, people were really into mourning in a way that they hadn't been previously. And that's when you'll get these really elaborate weeping angels and stuff like that in graveyards. And oftentimes they were mass produced. If you were expensive and fancy, you could afford to have someone, carve something in marble for you. If you were not, you would buy something that might have been cast in cement or, something like that. So they were kind of the knockoff mass produced versions of these things. And I think that's also part of this same discourse of this period, the putting up of monuments, even to your own family members, if you could afford to.
Right. That's interesting. And and if you walk through Victorian or old cemeteries, you see these ones that are just like a common one I've noticed is it's like it looks like a tree branch or something that's been shattered, like the life cut off too early.
Yeah.
So that's something that I guess is not really, that trope faded out at some point.
Yeah.
And yeah, there definitely was a lot more I don't know, creativity about what will go into a cemetery. Back then, when it seems like now, I mean, like this whole history of like the cemeteries were like the public spaces, the first public spaces, and people would like picnic in them, and because it was open space far from the city and stuff like that, so people would spend more time, and maybe they'd visit their deceased relatives and have a picnic also, or something like that. So people would have a different relationship to it than we do now. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the pulling down of the statue. You don't talk about this explicitly in your piece; it's more about the putting up. But so we're in an age where an iconoclastic age, people are pulling down statues, and it made me think, like, why is it? Why just become a focus? Why do people care so much on both sides about the statue? Why are there soldiers or police officers who look like soldiers surrounding certain monuments and guarding them like they're guarding, Fort Knox or something like that? Why do we care about this so much? So do you have any initial thoughts on why both people still really care about statues and why now it's become like one of the focal points of like literal violence, these statues?
Well, I think, as you say, it's been coming for a few years. And, in Britain, there was the Rhodes Must Fall thing in Oxford, which was to do with the influence of Cecil Rhodes and his legacy in Oxford, but particularly also a statue of him. And, oftentimes it is around a particular historical individual who has a legacy that, does still resonate. And I think in many cases, people do find offensive. But I think some of the other statues you see coming down seem to be just a little bit more random. And I think some of the people pulling them down maybe don't know who the person was. There was some cases that I saw reporting, statues of abolitionists. It's like, well, if your argument is you're doing this for Black Lives Matter, I'm not sure that that's really your ideal target. I mean, taking down, obviously, the statues that were to the Confederacy, that were explicitly white supremacist, you can say, well, yeah, obviously, I mean, these things don't really deserve a place in our public sphere anymore. But I think, as you say, I think these things often get a bit out of hand. And, we've had statues coming down that I think possibly there's less of a strong argument for taking them down. I don't know. I think it raised a lot of questions, too, though, about what should be in these public spaces. Are they things that, the general public should get a vote on? Are they something that, there should be some sort of public consensus over what should be in these spaces? I don't know that there's necessarily so much of an interest in replacing these statues with something else, although it did happen in Bristol where the Edward Colston statue got taken down, got thrown into the harbor. He was a slave trader. And
so I've never heard of this person before. Is this a prominent figure in the UK, or?
I would say he's prominent in Bristol in terms of the fact that a lot of things are named after him in the town, and he, in his lifetime, gave a lot of money to things, and so his name's on a lot of stuff. But the debate around his statue really sort of came to the fore, I want to say, in the last 5 years. People had been arguing about the fact that it shouldn't be there, that he represents a particularly nasty legacy, and that we shouldn't be regarding him as, a proud father of the city, as it were. So anyway, his statue was ripped down and thrown in the harbor. You could say fair enough. And then it was replaced a little while ago. Someone had actually made a statue of one of the women who had been involved in tearing the statue down and put it up in his place, which I thought was actually quite clever. I mean, they'd worked very quickly, whoever the artist was, I can't remember, and they built this statue of this woman protester. And now that's been taken down too. So
was that taken down by a crowd or by the city?
I think it was probably taken down by the authorities, but I'm not 100%.
That's funny. Yeah, I mean, this is like it's a deep subject that is strange to me in some ways. Like there's things that almost that I think go like beyond logic when people are talking about this stuff. So taking down, the Confederate statues, that's been a flashpoint for a long time in the U.S. Columbus statues are another one. And as you know, a lot of these statues were put up by like Italian American associations and seen as, memorializing the contribution of Italians or Italian Americans to the American story. And, and now people have a somewhat different view of Columbus than they did 100 years ago, but a lot of Italians, there's still a connection there. They still see it, this is the whole, like, this is connected to the Columbus Day thing, which some people want to rebrand as Indigenous Peoples Day or something like that. And yeah, so it's complicated. And then I just want to, so I live in Jersey City now, and when the statue toppling started, someone posted on Jersey City Reddit saying, what about, we really the Columbus statue in Jersey City should be taken down. And I hadn't actually seen it before, and it's kind of like a statue that must have been put up by a nearby Catholic church, and it's kind of like Columbus, the crusading Christian. He's holding a cross, a giant cross, up like this. So it's not the traditional image of Columbus. And so I guess there's a couple, reasons people could get pissed off that one. And then, but the person who, laid out this post was making the case against Columbus, and they were like, why don't we put a statue of someone else up who had a connection to the area? How about Peter Stuyvesant?
Okay.
and there were like 50 people in the comments who were like, don't you know what Peter Stuyvesant did? So it was almost, there was just something funny there, but like, so Peter Stuyvesant was, I don't know his entire history. He was like the first or second governor of, the New Netherlands and New Amsterdam. And so Jersey City across the Hudson River from, Manhattan had Dutch settlements here as well. So I mean, it's kind of like, on the one hand, like if we're looking for someone from like the 17th century to devote a statue to, well, they probably had some beliefs that we would not agree with today about a number of things, because that was 400 or 500 years ago. So that's part of it. And then, people were jokingly like, why don't we just put a statue of like a cat or, or like a flower or something? So I mean, there's also this question of like, what are, modern statues? And usually they don't look like, the statues from 1890. They're probably much more abstract, or they're entirely abstract. Or I'm thinking of the bust of JFK, which, that famous one, which looks like it was done with someone's thumbs or something, or the Gertrude Stein statue it's not, I can't remember the name of the park, but there's a Gertrude Stein statue, not in Central Park, but in another park in New York City on 42nd Street. So that's somewhat different also, and it's not like, there just seems to be a level of abstraction from who the actual person was to this being more of an artistic thing as opposed to just a person. Okay, so I've been talking for a while. Do you have any reaction to any of that?
I do think it's hilarious that someone said, let's replace the evil colonialist Columbus with a statue of Peter Stuyvesant. I mean, Columbus has been such an issue for a while. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, in 92, there was because it was the 500th anniversary, 1992, there was a lot of contention there about Columbus Day, about how it was celebrated. And I think it was around then you started getting some places renaming it Indigenous Peoples Day. That was also the year that those two awful Columbus movies came out that you might remember. There was one with Gerard Depardieu that was the more serious one.
Okay.
And there was another one with Tom Selleck that was really trashy.
Boy, I think I was maybe a little too young to see either of those, and they've passed by.
You know, and yeah, he is one of these figures that is, you know, really contentious. And, you know, I don't think anyone is really coming out nowadays and saying he was a great guy and we should celebrate him. I mean, the legacy of suffering on Indigenous peoples that his voyages led to is hardly something we can be proud of or want to mark. But as you say, I don't know who we would find from the 17th century that you would want to celebrate. I mean, your answer should be perhaps that, you know, maybe we shouldn't put a white guy up there. Maybe we should look to someone else.
Yeah, I mean, you could think it could be just a more or less, you know, regular person or something from that time. You know, it could be, yeah. I mean, picking someone who isn't a white male would be a little bit of a change. I mean, so you note in the piece that is this right? Am I understanding this right? There is not a statue of a woman in Central Park.
Not a statue of an actual woman who isn't just a classical or figurative thing. I mean, it's been something people talk about in the last few years. Find a statue of a woman in your city who isn't a classical figure or a queen. And chances are there will not be one. I mean, if you're in Britain, there's a good chance you'll find a statue of Queen Victoria somewhere. But other actual human women don't tend to get much of a look in. That's why they recently put up the Millicent Fawcett statue in London. So, you know, a woman in Parliament Square, which is, you know, a step forward. But, you know, quite recently that we've had that for the first time.
Mm-hmm. And so when they do these modern statues of, like, let's do someone who isn't a white man, is it done in the retro style and then it's kind of like almost a pastiche, or is it done in more like a modern style?
I think it varies a lot. I'm not really an expert on contemporary statuary. The Millicent Fawcett one is, you would say, in a fairly traditional style of sculpture. It represents essentially the period that she was from, which is the early 20th century.
And she was a suffrage campaigner?
She was a suffragette, yeah. The other actual woman I was going to say that you've got a big statue of in London is Boadicea, or Boudica.
Right.
So I guess she was a real person. But
was she a real person? I thought she's like a semi-mythical, but maybe she was real, like a Celtic queen.
I think she was real.
Okay.
What we know about her and her interactions with the Romans are probably a little embroidered.
Okay. Okay, so let's talk about tearing down the statues. So I was thinking about there's a famous instance in American history of during the Revolution, tearing down the statue of King George III that was in Lower Manhattan, and, you know, smelting it or whatever and turning it into bullets. That's at least how they teach it to you, like in elementary school. I don't know if it really happened like that, but that's maybe the most famous tearing down of a statue in most of U.S. history. And then there's the tearing down of statues in the popular conception of, like, the statues of Lenin coming down after the fall of the Soviet Union, the statue of Saddam being torn down during their first, you know, like week 3 of the Iraq War, and it had to be helped by the you know, American tanks and stuff had to help pull it down, which was, like, looking back, you know, a prescient metaphor about, you know, what it would take in that country, and then so those are tyrants, you know, and the government has changed, and tyranny has fallen. At least people think tyranny has fallen, and so they run out to start tearing down the hated statue of the tyrant. So this is different than what's happening now, because, as you said, you know, they're going after Columbus and you know, Jeb Stuart or something, but they're also going after some random person who was like an abolitionist whose statue was near the Wisconsin State House or something along those lines. Maybe it was in Minnesota, but yeah. So there's almost like a statue tear down fever. Like this is like a meme that's spreading, and people, like, want to get in on the action. And I mean, I'm sure it must be really exciting if you're, like, literally pulling on a rope with, like, a dozen or so of your comrades, and then the thing topples and everyone claps. That has to be super fun. But that's different than the government saying we are taking this down and like sending some construction equipment to do it, or they do it in the middle of the night without announcing it because they want to protect the statue. So these are possible different ways the statue can get off its pedestal. What do you think of why people are now running out to, tear down kind of thing? And but also the whole, like, it does seem better to me for the government to be doing it than for a like mob, quote unquote, of people to be doing it, because just a bunch of people can't decide to change the landscape on their own. That seems somewhat wrong to me. It should be done through democratic processes. So yeah, what do you think of that?
Well, I think, as you say, that there's different situations. I think most of us were kind of, I don't know, pleased to see, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that, people were able to rip down these statues of Lenin across Eastern Europe, that this was their expression of finally getting free from, the communist dictatorship. And, I don't think anyone was sad when we saw statue, indeed, of Saddam Hussein coming down, when these sort of tyrants get ripped down. I mean, that is symbolic, and I think it's important for the people involved in pulling it down. I mean, you saw people hitting the statue of Saddam Hussein with their shoe. I mean, this was a real expression of their personal anger towards this government that had mistreated them. And so I think, in a sense, they're entitled to that. I mean, as opposed to the government taking them down elsewhere, I think there was this week, I would probably have to check, in Chicago, two statues of Columbus did come down, I think were taken down by the government, by the city officials, I think preemptively. And I don't think that was necessarily to preserve them, but I think so that they didn't become a focus. I mean, I don't think they're probably going to be put back up, but...
Right. Well, I mean, one thing, at least in the earlier iteration of the, circa 2017, the idea, the kind of like the good liberal opinion was like, okay, take them down, but put them in a museum, and we'll explain who these people were and why what they did was bad. And so it's the Indiana Jones. This belongs in a museum. It doesn't. It should be, where you can have all sorts of historical relics, and you're not giving like a value statement or approval to it. But now that seems, I don't know, I haven't heard that in this round, that the statue of Jeb Stuart should be put in a museum. I mean, first of all, how many statues of Jeb Stuart are there out there? Like, they probably made a lot of them, about 50, I don't know. So you could have just a museum of Jeb Stuart statues. And then also, who the hell cares about Jeb Stuart, 150 plus years after the Civil War, and who wants to go look at his statue in a museum? And so it's more, it most just seems like, let's destroy this shit and throw it in the river. And does that only happen in Bristol, or did that happen? It seemed like people were inspired they wanted to do it other places, but it's not always as easy to. The statue needs to be fairly close to the river.
Relatively close to the river, but I think also he had, or rather Constance statue had been such a focus of people's resentment for such a long time that, he attracted more, specific anger, I think, than I think most other statues. And that particularly was why there was the big momentum to get him down, and throwing him in the river was quite symbolic because of Bristol having been a slave port, or rather throwing him in the harbor, sorry. And, I think there was a great emotional build-up towards that. And that I think there hasn't been necessarily towards other statues that weren't recognized as such problematic figures in some places. I mean, what you say about what we do with them when they've come down, I mean, some of them have been more or less destroyed, some of them haven't. There is a place that I've heard about in Lithuania, which is they call it like Stalin World, and it's a statue park of all these ripped down Soviet-era statues that they've just put up, put into this park. So I think you can go and visit and just go and look at Soviet statues if that's your thing, which I think is quite funny. But this notion of just put them in a museum, I think kind of expresses, I want to say, one of the problems with how the general public think of museums as just like a warehouse of old stuff. I don't think most museums actually want these things. And the idea that, because the people saying, oh, put it in a museum, they are never going to go and look at it in that museum. The museum is going to be stuck with a whole bunch of statues that nobody actually wants to see. Nobody's going to be paying an entrance fee to visit. I mean, what are they supposed to do with them?
The museum. Who wants to run the Museum of Confederate Statuary? That's all these all these guys on horses that were displaced from, public squares in towns and cities across the South. I guess there's some audience for that, but not a huge one. Yeah. So then, but what do you? I mean, if the government removes Robert E. Lee's statue or something, what do you think should happen to it?
I don't know. I mean, I think depending on what it is. I mean, it's one of these things, separate the art from the artist. If it was actually something hypothetically that was sculpted by Rodin or someone of significance as an artist in their own right, then it might be of more interest than just a sculpture that was made by some random person and of little artistic or historical merit. I really read a fantastic suggestion on Twitter, which was dump them all in the ocean so they become an artificial reef. And then people could go diving and swim around them. I think that's just fantastic.
Well, like they do with subway cars. That's actually beautiful if you think about it. That it. Well, I mean, we don't know. We're killing the reefs, the reefs because of the acid in the ocean water, or whatever. But if you can imagine, in 100 years, they're all covered in coral and so forth, and people are just swimming around them, and they're like, "Who are these? Who is this man? Who is this Jeb Stuart person? We don't know who he is. We don't care." So that is a very poetic end to them. I wanted to mention briefly a statue controversy type thing that happened over the past month. So I used to live in Rochester, New York. The two famous historical citizens from Rochester, New York are Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass. And there's lots of stuff named after them around. The main bridge in Rochester is the Freddie Sue, people call it locally, Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony Bridge. So Rochester is also... So Douglass lived for like 30 years or something in Rochester. But there's not much that's still there from his time. There's a Susan B. Anthony house where she lived. But I think all the places Douglass lived have been torn down, and some of them is just like a parking lot, so it's kind of sad. But there is a statue of Douglass that was, as far as I understand, the first statue of an African-American erected in the United States. And it would have been like, fairly soon after his death, maybe in like 1880 or something. So within this era. And it's in sort of the main park, Highland Park, in Rochester, that is somewhat equivalent to Central Park. And so that I always thought that was a kind of cool thing. And then so there was a news story about 3 weeks ago that a Frederick Douglass statue was defaced and like thrown into a gorge. And I don't know if you caught this one, but it caught my eye, and I was like, "Oh no! Did they did they take the statue? Like, this is a historical statue. This is not just Jeb Stuart number 27. Like, this is a true historical statue of an actual admirable American." And like, did they destroy it? So I was upset at first, and so I'm saying I don't even understand why people care about these statues so much, but I cared about this one. But then it turned out they're like, no, this is another statue that was a different part of the city. And I was like, oh, I didn't even know there was another statue of Douglass there on the other side of the river. And then it seemed like they don't know, some people took it off and threw it like down a gorge, like into a river. And so it was destroyed. But then I was just trying to close the loop on this. And so what actually happened was that a couple years ago, there was a like civic art project where a sculptor made 12 or something like that copies of the original Douglass statue, and then changed them in some ways where like maybe like the hand was like missing or something, or like there was like an empty space, where his chest would be or something. So used like modern techniques such that each one looked a little different and didn't really look like the real one. And they put them all around the city, in some in places that were relevant to Douglass's life, and some just in like parks and stuff. And so it was one of these that was, lifted up and thrown into the gorge. So it was a modern, like postmodern replica of an actual historical statue. And so, but just a couple days ago, they replaced it. They had put out 12, but made 13. There was like one still in the warehouse. So they replaced the one that was thrown in, and put it in a spot that actually does have some historical interest, because it was a spot where escaped slaves would go to and go up the Genesee River into Lake Ontario and head to Canada. So, but it also like, so it was more like a piece of art and a replica than an actual thing. But the way it was reported originally, it was like they're going after Frederick Douglass now. Like, no statue is safe. They're destroying Frederick Douglass, these crazy lefties. And then if you thought about it for a second, you'd be like, well, it's possible that some lefties went after Frederick Douglass, but probably more likely that like some righties tried to take down Frederick Douglass. I guess they don't know who actually did it. But yeah, so it's strange. It's just strange overall. And anyway, if you want to go to Rochester, the statue has been replaced there, thankfully. And I don't know if I thought this was just a temporary exhibit or something, but I guess maybe they're going to leave it up forever. But, they're made out of plexiglass or something, so it's fairly easy to, like, lift it up and throw it in the river, just a couple people, if they wanted to, as opposed to, needing a bunch of people. So, yeah, I don't even know what to think about that entire episode, but people still care about statues, even if they're kind of, like, weird fake ones.
Yeah, I mean, I find it really interesting that I suspect kind of cynically that some people who want to take down statues, and also some people who are suddenly desperately, let's protect this is part of our heritage. I think if you'd asked these people a year ago, none of them had heard of this statue or this person that the statue represents. They've got this sudden passion about it. Let's save our heritage. I bet you most of those people couldn't name the person in the statue or anything they were famous for or why they want to keep it. It's this. So I think a lot is being projected onto these statues that represents other, obviously, cultural, political tensions.
Yeah, and I mean, if the average statue, if you walk by it and it doesn't have like the person's name on it, maybe unless it's like Abraham Lincoln or something, there's only you're like, who is this person? Why is this here? Or probably you don't even think about it. You just ignore it and keep on walking to wherever you go. So. Yeah, it's strange. I just want to realize I should plug another statue that's in Jersey City, which is a statue that I think is called Lincoln the Mystic. That was it's an interesting statue of Lincoln where he's sitting down and looking very dejected. So it's not a heroic statue, and it was built around or installed around 1930. So at the end of this period that you note, and it's in Lincoln Park in Jersey City. Okay, do you have anything else on statues before we move on to our next topic?
No, I think I'm done.
Okay,
on the statue.
I think we covered the ground, but then I feel like we could keep on talking about this for a long time because it is just such a strange resonant topic. But another thing I want to talk to you about was a TEDx talk that you gave in 2019 called "How to Be a Tourist," and we'll include the link. And I encourage people to check it out. And so. So the era of tourism has at least paused, and maybe it's come to an end. But probably not. But who knows? So how are you thinking? Can you just talk a little bit about the initial argument in this TED talk you gave, and then how you think about it now that we're in coronavirus world?
Well, I mean, my talk was about how we have this discourse of over-tourism, which is often quite snobbish in the sense of my travel is necessary. It's your travel that's destroying the planet. And that's often the subtext there. And it's much like many discussions of overpopulation. There's always just enough of me, far too many of you, which is often the not so hidden subtext of these things. And when it comes to travel, people, particularly these days of Instagram and social media, it's very much an experience that they're wanting to project onto another audience. So it's not necessarily what they're experiencing. It's the image of what they're experiencing that they want to send to someone else. So, taking the selfie in the right place with a beautiful view or whatever. And you see these photos of people. Obviously, we all know that crowds of people with selfie sticks. It's like they're not even experiencing the environment they're visiting. They're only seeing it through their own screen in order to get the right photo or whatever for Instagram likes later on. And so, I was talking about, the importance of travel and thinking about what you're doing as a traveler and whether maybe it's not necessary to visit to some of the more over-touristed areas. Maybe if you really want to do the right thing, you should just not go to these places if you actually care about them. Because people talk about conscious travel, and it's always about how you can travel but do it more ecologically. It's never about how you can just not. Maybe that's the best thing to do. Although, of course, now we're in a situation where pretty much most of us are just not traveling. And that raises questions too, because you see places where economies have become entirely dependent on travel and not just on local travel. A lot of cities are really dependent on people flying in from all over the world to maintain their economy. And when that's not happening, you've got cities that are major travel hubs like Singapore currently getting basically no visitors. And that's, hugely disruptive to their economies when you have a huge proportion of the population otherwise employed in ways that depend on travel.
Right. This is a side note, but did you see the piece in the Times in the last week or so about the town in Thailand, I believe, that is a tourist spot because of all the monkeys that live there? And now what's happening to the monkeys now that the tourists aren't there to feed them anymore?
I don't think I saw that. Is it that they're not getting enough food because the tourists aren't there?
Yes. So it's like funny and sad and strange. I'll include the link to it below. But basically, this was like a historical, like, I think Hindu monastery area. It could be Buddhist. And then it always attracted travelers. And then in modern day, the travelers started coming more to see all these monkeys that are very tame and will take like a piece of apple out of your hand. Mm-hmm. And then all the travelers stopped. The monkeys are still around. And now the monkeys are harassing everyone, all the shopkeepers and people who live in this area constantly and like causing crazy mischief, like because they're so smart and they just are, it's like a toddler, it's like there's 1,000 hungry toddlers who are like running around this town. It's an unanticipated result of the virus. So in the talk you say there's the traveler, and this is like a lofty thing, and there's the tourist, and everyone hates tourists, or at least if you live in a tourist spot, you hate tourists. And like so, being a tourist is bad, being a traveler is good, but you note that like anywhere you can travel to, someone has been there before to find it, or, build the infrastructure there, or make it easier to get there. And so the travel and the tourist, is there a difference? Do you see a difference between them at all? Or are they just a fancy name for the same thing?
I think they're the same thing. I think people are kidding themselves when I'm a traveler, I'm a citizen of the world, this sort of stuff. I think that's absolutely a load. I think you're a tourist and you should admit it. I just quickly looked up this monkey story. I think that's very funny. I haven't been there. I have been to a monkey jungle in Indonesia, which is similarly, they are kind of looked after by the monks, but they are very, very keen on stealing food from tourists. They will rip a sandwich out of your bag, that kind of thing. So I don't know what they're doing right now with the lack of tourists. Probably the same thing. Probably running around and stealing from everyone in the place.
Right. One of the funny details is that there's some cops, or somewhere between a cop and an animal control officer in the town, and his weapon is a slingshot. And so they say he'll go the slingshot and the monkey will run away, but he actually never shoots them. He doesn't have any ammo for the slingshot. So once the monkeys figure out that they never actually get shot, after a couple times, they don't care about the slingshot thing anymore. And so I guess he needs to figure out some new way to scare the monkeys away.
But they must have seen someone fire a slingshot.
Maybe originally.
To know that it was something to be scared of.
That's a good point. Maybe at first they were given like little rocks or something and then maybe they decided that was too cruel to the monkeys. And just the idea of control, monkeys are, too many monkeys is not a problem that you think about very often, but you can't, it seems mean just like euthanize them or something, because they clearly have a higher consciousness than, standard vermin or whatever. But it's okay. But getting back to the traveling, one thing this made me think about was, I mentioned this on another episode, I am somewhat new to the world of online dating and app-based dating. And so, it's very based around photographs, but it's also like the theme of travel and like giving your identity through travel is very encouraged. And like, there'll be little question prompts, and it'll be like, give me travel tips for blank, or my craziest travel story is blank. And it really does seem like, in modern people who are on the dating market are defining themselves through the kind of travel they're doing. And then also the photos is what really reminded me of your talk, because if you click through enough photos, you start to notice patterns. And so some of them are everyone's taking the same vacation to the same place, taking the same photo. One is the same spot in Machu Picchu. I guess when you finish climbing the mountain or whatever, you take a photo as you're like exhausted sitting there, and the top of Kilimanjaro, and the Louvre, and holding your fingers up like this over the tip. It's like the thing with the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Like, people don't do that anymore. That's lame. But the going and like pinching the very top of the
the glass pyramid at the Louvre.
Yes, the Aryeh pyramid at the Louvre is the thing you do. And yes, I've seen that replicated at least 100 times on this app. It's strange. So in some ways, it's just like, well, everyone is kind of the same. Everyone has the same ideas what they think a funny photo or a cute photo is. But yeah, and then I've almost, there's this Twitter joke that's like XYZ isn't a personality, and it's like, travel isn't a personality. And then all these people who really define themselves through travel, and also in the dating apps, they say in their bio, I've visited 50 countries, I've visited all 7 continents. Just, like, this is obviously very important to them. And now they're stuck here, wherever, and they can't go and travel anymore. I guess it has to suck for them if this is like their main source of, like what they did in their free time or source of pleasure or something. So in some ways I'm like feeling a little bad for them, but in other ways I'm like, well, maybe you'll like read a book or something now if you can't travel to like your 51st country. So yeah, I don't know.
Do you remember that website, Stuff White People Like?
Yes.
That sounds entirely like that, because I bet you could say stuff white people like: taking a photo at Machu Picchu, taking a photo of themselves doing yoga on the beach in Costa Rica. It sounds entirely like that particular
I think thankfully people of all races will go to Paris, and when they go to the Louvre, take the photo of pinching the top of the glass pyramid. It just seems to be a universal, or at least women. I don't know if men are also pinching the top of the glass pyramid. But then it's also like, I've seen this photo 500 times. Do I need to go to the Louvre and pinch the top of the glass pyramid? I think I've had the experience. I think, and not a lot of people have the photo with them and the Mona Lisa or something like that, which I guess it was famously like very crowded around looking at the Mona Lisa because of all the travelers / tourists, and now that can't that can't happen at least currently in our reality. Do you want to talk about museums? That seems to lead us into museums. Or is there anything else you want to say about travel and how we can't travel right now?
No, I think it will be interesting, though, to see how the travel industry sort of restores after this. Which kinds of travel people go back for and which kinds they don't, particularly if, God forbid, we don't have a vaccine and people are still having to think about, safety and risks of catching the COVID. What kind of travel people will be willing to risk and what kind they won't.
Mm-hmm. It just seems, I don't know. Yeah, in the near future, the whole travel world seems almost completely cut off, and I don't know, maybe only like be super rich who have like a Gulfstream room or something, or are traveling like for any sort of exotic vacation. Okay, so. Museums. So you mentioned you have a piece and process on museums and how people understand them. We mentioned this a little bit, and also how could museums like move forward? When so many tourists aren't here, and when you can't have crowds of people inside. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I mean, I read this a little while ago. I don't know about you, but I'm on the mailing list of quite a few museums, and I'm a member of a few museums. And, you're kind of used to getting lots of emails from them saying, we need money. I mean, you get an email from them every week, give money to this, that, and the other. And then when the coronavirus broke out and they start sending more of these emails and they're more desperate, and you start realizing they're really, really, really in trouble. I mean, some of, particularly smaller museums that aren't, really state sponsored or that don't have large sort of endowments are really, really struggling, particularly if they're in cities that have been closed off to travel, and they're dependent largely on long-distance visitors to maintain their business. I mean, museums often depend on things like school visits as well, and that's been out of the question while schools have been closed. And so I think it's going to raise questions about how we think about what museums do in order to raise money. There's been museums taking different approaches to put more of their stuff online. You may have noticed this Museums Unlocked thing on social media, where a lot of museums are showing elements of their collection, and it's great. I think it's wonderful. People are learning more about what's there, but I don't know how much that's actually going to turn into income for these museums in the future. I don't know how many people are going to have seen that on Twitter and thought, oh, I've definitely got to go to that museum once the coronavirus is over.
Yeah.
And I think it's just going to raise a lot of questions about what museums will survive. I mean, your big ones like, the V&A, the Met, the Louvre, I mean, obviously they're going to survive. No doubt about that. But it's going to be the littler, more idiosyncratic museums that I think they will struggle more, particularly if they're in expensive cities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just a couple days ago, the Tenement Museum on the Lower East Side of Manhattan announced that they were laying off all of their tour guides. Which was 75 people, so it seemed like the bulk of their staff. And I'd gone there for the first time in the fall and really enjoyed it. And I think the tour guides are mostly actors who this is a kind of a day job. And so the guy was great who gave our tour. So that was a bummer. And that's also a very, very site specific kind of thing. And also you don't want to be in a tenement during a, viral pandemic. So I don't know how they're going to possibly do it unless they end up getting bailed out by the city or the state or something. So yeah, it's depressing. Thinking about
they were actually one of the ones I was writing about, the Tenement Museum, because you've got other museums like art museums that oftentimes, I mean, ideally they wouldn't, but when they get really pressed, they might be able to sell that piece of art to tide them over for a few months. For something like the Tenement Museum, where the artifact is the building, they don't have stuff they can just take down to Sotheby's.
Right. Yeah, the artifacts are some scissors that were found in between the floorboards from 1900. So do you see any sort of model besides bailout that could help these cultural institutions?
Yeah, I really don't know. I mean, I was thinking of something. There was one of the theatres in London did a production recently, or are doing multiple productions, and the name they've given it is slipped my mind. But basically, people were buying tickets as they would to a normal theatre production to watch a stream of a play that was performed in the theatre with no audience. And I'm wondering whether museums might be able to do something like that, where people pay for a virtual private tour. I mean, that's something they could do in this environment and probably make some money from. Yeah. But I don't know what else in the long term would be a viable strategy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of it is, it does seem like a thing where being there in person is key to the experience. Like a play, we're used to watching things on TV, so that's somewhat the same. I saw a production of Heroes of the Fourth Turning, which was a off-Broadway play that came out last year. They did a one-off, and they kind of redid it for Zoom, and everyone seemingly was just in their in a room in their apartment, but it worked really well. And I hadn't seen the play before, and now I want to see the stage version to see how it was different and see the actors in real life, if that ever is possible again. But yeah, I don't know, there was this, Google did something with museums where they took the kind of Google Street View machine and, so you can kind of walk through a museum virtually, but I guess it's cool, but it's who's in the same way, oh, I want to go to the museum today. You'd be like, oh, I'll just look at the Google thing today. It just isn't the same. So yeah, I don't know. It's bad. I don't know.
Maybe to have the true museum experience, they can also, DoorDash you some really overpriced coffee and a piece of cake or something.
Right. And, pump in some the sounds of annoying people talking behind you as you're trying to contemplate the great art and stuff like that. Okay, so we'll look forward to that piece coming out sometime soon. And so I will ask the question that I teased at the very beginning about Twitter and you, which is your Twitter avatar, which is very mysterious to me. And in my head, it always just kind of makes me think of a rabbit. But can you describe what it looks like and what it actually is?
Well, it is me with what look like big ears, and they are ears. It's a resin model of bilby ears, and a bilby is a little marsupial about the size of a rabbit that lives in Australia, and it was at a zoo, and they have these ears. So it's as if a bilby was human size. This is how big their ears would be, and you can take your picture with them. And so it's less mysterious. I've had some people ask me, they thought they were lobster claws.
That was actually, yeah. I mean, that's what they kind of look like in a way, but they also look like rabbit ears. But they also kind of look like a fossil or something. Yeah. Okay, well, mystery solved. And okay, so so what is your Twitter handle if people want to see you and with the ears or follow you or whatever?
I am at Katrina Gulliver, and I'm sure you can put a link to that underneath.
Sure. Yeah, your Twitter handle will be underneath this. My Twitter handle is RACW. Anything else before we shall we wrap it up?
No, I think we're wrapping it up. I think you should post the pictures that you're using for your online dating profile. Maybe the picture of you doing yoga in Machu Picchu or whatever.
Well, I'll consider it. So I am not a global traveler, and so most of the most exotic location that one of my photos is from is a used bookstore in Knoxville, Tennessee. But otherwise, it's not super exciting. And I don't know. Yeah, I like. Do people want? I don't know. Do people like? Is it more appealing? Is it less appealing? Especially now, like what has changed? I guess that's a different conversation. If they're all their photos are of them in exotic places, and we're in our current reality, it's kind of like, that's all you got. Like, okay, I guess you don't have not a huge conversationalist or something, right now. So I don't know. Okay, so
what's the alternative? Is the coronavirus version? Here's a photo of me at a Zoom meeting in my living room. Here's a photo of me on a Zoom meeting in my yard. Here's a photo of me in a Zoom meeting from my bedroom.
Well, the one kind of strategy that people do is they'll have like almost like a high and a low. So they'll like someone, at it looks like a gala premiere or something, all dressed up, and then the other one is like just them like hanging out at home. And so like the Corona selfie is one, and so you're looking kind of disheveled, but like also not that disheveled, like still pretty good, and so I guess this is what I'll look like on a Zoom if we do a Zoom chat or something like that. So yeah, who knows? I guess this will continue to develop. So, okay, I think that's all I have. Okay, thanks for coming on, Katrina. And all the stuff that we mentioned will be linked on the blogging site below. And so thank you for taking the time, and thank you to our viewers and listeners, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you.